The word to sum up the mood in England, across its great cities, those invincible suburbs, its villages and towns, is surely weariness. On Monday, those weary 56 million will be told their immediate, or perhaps not so immediate, futures, how far the nation is unlocked and when. Everyone shares the same crushing sense that we've been here before, at the same time that the vaccine dares us to hope that this time it might be different. We've heard so much about the national vaccine rollout, which has been Herculean, but we've heard much less about the differences within the country, within regions, even within towns and cities, and certainly within communities which exist on that vaccine rollout, even on cases. The picture nationally is not uniform, and that fact could be crucial in terms of the decisions being made on unlocking in just 48 hours' time. The picture across the country is uneven. If we look at cases, whilst the 7-day rolling average for London and the South East is now at or around 100 cases per 100,000, north of the Wash, cases are much higher, for example 180 per 100,000 in the East Midlands. And even within cities, there is a massive difference in vaccination rate, one of the key factors which is meant to make unlocking possible. According to City Council data seen by Newsnight, the situation in Birmingham, the biggest local authority in the country, is stark. The rate for single-dose vaccination for the over 80s in the city overall is 85.8%. But in Balsall Heath, a poor and deprived part of the city, where over 88% of the population is part of an ethnic minority, the rate is at a much lower 57%. Even in whiter but still poor areas like King's Standing, it's 77.5%. Contrast with wealthy and white Sutton, where every ward is around 90% or over. It's a pattern repeated across the city. Generally speaking, the richer the ward and the whiter the ward, the higher its vaccination rate and the lower its case rate. In Balsall Heath, one of the poorest parts of the country, they've set up a vaccination centre in the local mosque. Have you been noticing, have you had problems in terms of people coming forward or people who are locally who are reluctant to have the vaccine?
There is vaccine hesitancy in the community. There's no doubts about that, and they are due to various reasons for this. So there's lots of myths surrounding the vaccine, more initially than now. A lot of work has already been done to dispel these myths.
And what are the sort of things that people say, those myths that you talk about? What are they?
So, are the ingredients safe? Will it change my genes? The other one we normally get a lot of is, will it, affect my fertility? So, simple things like that. Will I get tracked? And things like that. I guess the correlation is mainly due to deprivation, language, and perhaps mistrust for higher authorities.
Mistrust in governments and authority in general?
Perhaps that would be the reason. Education, deprivation plays a huge part.
Community leaders too have been doing all they can to dispel those lies about the vaccine. Take-up is improving, but slowly. And it leaves some of those leaders worrying that if unlocking happens too soon, communities like his won't be ready. I suppose the danger is if we don't get the vaccination rates in minority communities up to the same rates as they are in, say, white communities, then ethnic minority communities are going to be more in danger when we start unlocking, right?
Yeah, obviously, if people do not go for their jobs, we are in for danger. I've seen so many people dying in my community. I buried about 19 people last year, when normally we would bury only 4 to 5 people in a year. And this year so far we have lost about 5 to 6 people. This is a reality.
Generally, the indicators are going in the right direction, even in areas, as here, with higher case rates. But it is the differential rates of progress across the country and the fact that data on certain things remains incomplete, which leaves some scientists concerned too.
I think until we've got the data, then you can't really make a solid decision based on science. We need the data to see that the numbers are falling and that the vaccination programme is really kicking in.
In effect, the danger is that we're making the decision next week based on political considerations rather than science and having the full breadth of scientific data at our disposal.
Yes, I think that's correct. We really need to see that the cases are falling, particularly amongst our ethnic minority populations, that they're being protected, people are taking up the vaccine. Until we know that, we really shouldn't be coming out of lockdown.
Or making decisions about potentially coming out of lockdown.
Yes, or making decisions about lockdown. We need the evidence that what we've done so far is working.
And so that's the thing to watch out for next week, whether ministers promise to unlock according to fixed dates or to the changing data. The former desired by many on the Tory benches, the latter by many scientists. We're fond of talking about the national picture, our collective experience. But as Birmingham reminds us, really, there's no such thing, and that should make Boris Johnson's decisions all the harder.
Lewis Goodall there in Birmingham. I'm joined now by Conservative MP Alberto Costa and two scientists advising the government on its coronavirus response, the modeller, Professor Thomas House, and Professor Susan Michie, whose research focuses on behaviour change in relation to health. She sits on the government's SAGE Advisory Committee, but is speaking tonight in a personal capacity. So let's start with you, Professor Thomas House there. The modelling show we're currently at 12,000 cases according to the data today. What's the threshold where we can start to seriously think about lifting elements of this lockdown? Is it the R rate? Is it the 1,000 cases that we might get to in April?
Well, the important thing to realise is these decisions are always driven by politics and values as much as they are by technical or mathematical considerations. But what I think people need to understand is this disease is very infectious. The R rate now is close to 1, primarily because of the non-pharmaceutical interventions. We believe that if people returned to their behaviour of about a year ago, there is insufficient immunity, either due to natural infection or vaccination, to control spread. So we have to think carefully about that, but it's never the case. I think it's important to stress it's never the case that those numbers on their own determine what we need to do, because we also need to know what's going on, exactly as you said in the package, these difficult trade-offs, what's going on in the communities, the real details, as well as that big picture of just how infectious this is and how much immunity there needs to be before normal behaviour will not lead to increased spread.
So, Professor House, I mean, last time, maybe 10 months ago, the suggestion was that we had to protect the capacity of the NHS to deal with this. The goalposts have shifted here, haven't they? This is a stronger standard you're trying to meet in order to lift the restrictions.
Well, that's why I said it's a value judgment, that actually if numbers are very low, then fast growth means much less, because it's small numbers on top of small numbers. The problem is that when something is this infectious, we can lose control and end up making decisions that may be very, very much worse from every point of view, because our hand has been forced. Whereas if we can be careful, I think everyone hopes that we can really see a roadmap back to normal that's going to drive an appropriate balance. But there's no easy answer to that, and I think it would be, it's unfortunate to claim that it's easy in either direction, either that we can unlock very quickly because things are over, or to claim that things are so hopeless that we can't see normality. I think it's there. And we just need a real dose of realism about what is involved in the route to it. Okay,
dose of realism. Let's put that to Professor Susan Michie. You're the behavioural scientist. A year or so ago, we heard a lot about fears that people would become a little impatient with a lockdown that was brought in too early. It's now been going on for perhaps much longer than people had anticipated. Does the vaccine change things in terms of people's behaviour? Do we have any evidence for how that alters the equation?
In terms of adherence to the guidelines, the data show that it's been fairly high, and that's been the case since last summer. It hasn't dropped off, and for some behaviours, such as mask wearing, it's actually increased. So even though people may be being frustrated by the situation, fed up, I think they see the threat, the real threat there is, and the need to abide by the restrictions. And I think we now face a choice between, on the one hand, lifting restrictions, but facing what we had last year, where we have a yo-yo situation of in and out of more and less restrictive restrictions, or we open up very gradually, monitoring the situation with clear indicators as we go, and reviewing the situation and only opening up lifting the next wave of restrictions if it's seen to be safe. And I think that we're in a very fortunate position now, because we can really learn from what didn't work in this country over the last year. And we can also learn from what other countries throughout the world are doing very well, and pretty well back to many of the things we want to get back to. And that's not only Australia and New Zealand and China and Singapore and South Korea, Vietnam, all the countries in Southeast Asia who've had quite a lot of experience of managing this. But it's also countries such as Uruguay in Latin America and Norway and Finland in Europe.
So you think, Professor Michie, that the politicians are being too impatient?
Well, I think it's very difficult for politicians, because the job of politicians, in a way, is to make people feel good and to take short-term decisions which are attractive and which will make them popular. So I think it's really hard. I think they're in a very difficult position at the moment. And I really hope they hold their nerve, they listen to the scientific advice, because nobody wants another national lockdown.
Right. Well, let me put that directly to Alberto Costa. Nobody wants another lockdown. No one wants to be yo-yoing back into this situation. Everyone wants this to be the last lockdown. But you and your colleagues are putting a bit of pressure on Downing Street to lift things a little bit more quickly.
Well, I entirely agree with the Prime Minister's approach to this. No doubt he's got an enormously challenging task this weekend, over the next 48 hours, to look at the data and be advised as best as he can by the scientists and by the medics on the type of roadmap to get us out of this lockdown that we want to see on Monday. Now, the COVID research group, and I've looked at the letter that they've sent, the objectives that they have, to me at least, do not appear to differ at all from the government's. For example, they mention the national priority being reopening of schools. That is the government's top priority. The Prime Minister has said that. It's absolutely imperative that whatever the Prime Minister says on Monday, the reopening of schools must feature as one of the front and centre policies that the government have in terms of reopening our society. And I think the academics that we've got on the programme tonight just highlight how much of a challenge this is to the Prime Minister and his government. As Professor Howson said, there is no easy answer to this. It's a fast-moving, fluid and dynamic situation, and the Prime Minister is listening to the best advice that he can get, which is exclusively based on data. These are not decisions that the Prime Minister takes at whim. These are decisions based on the best advice that he's given. But it should be said that scientists themselves disagree on the data and the interpretation.
We had this, Alberto Costa, we had this sort of argument in autumn, and consensus would be that it led to a lifting of restrictions prematurely and a big spike in deaths that could have been avoided. At least the extent could have been avoided. Do you not look back on some of the experiences over the past 12 months and acknowledge that there was some regrets over the speed with which this argument is applied sometimes?
This is one of the biggest challenges that any government anywhere in the world is facing. How do we return our society? And we all want this, the academics that you have, all the viewers that are watching this, we all want to return to normality, but we are dealing with a once-in-a-century challenge. There is no textbook that one can pluck off the shelf.
Well, talking of textbooks, let's bring Thomas House back in on the schools issue. I mean, that does seem, we've seen what's happened with the Welsh Government today. Is that the first sort of low-hanging fruit, if you like? That's the restriction that you'd expect to be lifted. Are there risks associated?
Yes and yes, I think. It's obviously an emotive issue. It's our children. And it is true, scientists, we like to argue, we're very direct with each other, but that often hides the fact that our understanding has improved. And what we know is that this decision on schools is made even more difficult by the fact that children play what I've been calling kind of an intermediate role. So our prior belief about pandemics from influenza is that the role of children will be key. So in 2009, the closure of schools just due to holidays was sufficient to reduce R beneath 1. You can kind of see in the data when the schools are shut, flu does not spread. Then we very rapidly realised that was not the case for coronavirus, that risks and transmission actually went completely the other way. It was much more towards older ages. And actually quite early on, because of the way the order that lockdown restrictions were brought in, there was almost no evidence of transmission amongst children at all. It was early on an epidemic of hospitals and care homes, not of children, but of course the schools were shut. And now I think we've moved to an understanding that the risks are intermediate. We do know there is transmission in schools. Children participate in substantial chains of transmission, but how substantial is very, very hard to put an exact number on because of very few, no controlled experiments are being run, and we have to try to extract those numbers from very noisy data. And I think that is part of what makes it a difficult decision. I think
let me just bring in Professor Michie on this issue raised in Lewis Goodall's report of ethnic minority compliance with vaccination. What's the behavioural response? We've seen the campaigns, we've seen people just try to persuade. The numbers are quite stark there, 57% in one area of Birmingham versus 90% elsewhere. What's the answer here?
Well, we have a big challenge on our hands, because unless we get really high vaccination uptake throughout the whole population, we won't be able to get to the kind of population-wide immunity that's going to help us get out of this pandemic. And that requires a lot of skilled work, of being very engaged with the communities, taking the lead from communities that have been more hesitant, and really listening and understanding to that hesitancy. But that's not the only issue. We're in quite an unstable situation because we don't know how protective the vaccinations are, how long it lasts for, how much it has an effect on infectiousness. And because we still have such very high levels of community transmission, we're still at high risk of new variants that may become more resistant to the vaccinations. So it's absolutely imperative to have a priority of driving down community transmissions to a really low level, so it is safe enough to begin lifting the kind of restrictions we want lifted. Okay. And it's not enough just to drive it down. We also need to have a system in place to keep it down. And that is a really effective, locally based test, trace and supported isolation system. Again, we can learn from the rest of the world here, because in other countries that are successfully doing this, they are supporting with visiting people, with really good financial support, offering alternative accommodation, because most people can't isolate in their own homes. So we need a package here of a comprehensive strategy. And I really hope that on Monday, we hear about this comprehensive strategy, which includes very, very gradual lifting of restrictions, very careful monitoring, and really thinking about all the things we need to put in place to keep transmission low once we get it low.